Good afternoon and welcome back to our symposium on the past, present, and future of medieval digital humanities. I'm Nathan Daniels, a member of the Digital Medievalist Postgraduate Subcommittee and a PhD candidate in history at the Johns Hopkins University. Our second session today focuses on the present of images and imaging in the Americas. As in our previous session this morning, we have two panelists today who will give their talks, and then we'll have time for a Q&A and discussion afterward. So as you have questions, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will get to those after both talks. So without further ado, our first panelist this afternoon is Tracy Chapman Hamilton, who is an art historian and digital consultant. Her research focuses on late medieval and early modern visual culture in Europe and the Mediterranean, especially rooted in questions of gender studies, collecting, spatiality, and material culture. How women made themselves visible through patronage is the subject of her book, Pleasure and Politics at the Court of France, the Artistic Patronage of Queen Marie of Brabant, 1260 to 1321, recipient of the 2020 International Center of Medieval Arts Annual Book Prize. She is currently working on a series of digital projects. The first, Mapping Medieval Women, a digital map of women's lives and patronage in the global Middle Ages. A second, Race in Medieval Richmond, is a database and inquiry into how revival-style aesthetics were employed as socio-political tools by both Black and white communities in the urban landscape of the late 19th and early 20th century Southern capital. She has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Cress and DuPont Foundations, the International Center of Medieval Art, was a participant in the Cress Foundation Summer Institute for Digital Mapping and Art History at Middlebury College in 2014, and was one of the first two Mellon Fellows in the Digital Humanities at the Villa Itati, Harvard's University's Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in 2016 to 17. She has held positions at Virginia Commonwealth University, the University of Richmond, where she was an NEH visiting associate professor, and Sweetbriar College, where she originally received tenure. Dr. Hamilton's talk today is entitled Images for Art Historical Research and Teaching. Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen. Start that slideshow. Okay. This talk, as I say here in the opening slide, is dedicated to all the librarians and digital mentors and colleagues that I've been lucky to collaborate with over the years. And that's a message that I give as many people as I can, colleagues and students and people willing to hear me talk, that this is a collaborative process. So much that we do in the digital requires so many sources of expertise and that we can't do it alone. And I think it's a real way to model how the world should operate. So what we're doing here with the digital humanities and in digital art history in particular that I'm talking about today, I feel has much larger ramifications in terms of the way we operate as humans. And I also want to thank the Digital Medievalist Conference Committee, the Medieval Academy of America, and Christopher Cole for doing all the organization of this. And I also want to say that these 15 or 20 minutes that we have here can only begin to touch on the full breadth and depth of how art historians are employing the digital today. What I'll be presenting on is very much colored by my personal experience with how the digital and technology enhances my pedagogy, scholarship, and ability to participate in public outreach. And I acknowledge in advance that there will be applications, projects, and people who I don't address today, all the more for you to discover on your own. And I've posted a PDF of my slideshow in the chat. So if you want to download that and follow along, click on the links. I've included as much as I could in there, and I apologize for any any typos or anything in advance. I think it's okay, but at any rate, that's for you all. There's also probably more in there than I'm going to be able to cover today. And so I want to be sure, I wanted to give you as many of those resources as I could to refer to in the future, even past today. Databases, 3D printing, and digital mapping may not be the first things that come to mind when you envision art history. But the field of digital art history allows for a vast array of options for expanding your research and engaging in academic and public pedagogies. Digital art history is transforming how scholars, students, and the general public interact with and understand original objects and monuments. These tools allow us to visualize relationships in vast social networks of artists and patrons. And I'm going to go on at this point to showing some examples of some points I want to make about about digital art history, the state of digital art history at this point. But just to show you with this slide here, again, you have a copy of this, so you can come back to it, but I've labeled what the three examples I'm showing here, which is the database for our Mapping the Medieval Woman project, a 3D reconstruction of a Virgin and Child statue at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, and a beautiful example of art steps by one of Elizabeth Lastra's students in her Islamic arts class. And this is an online exhibit platform that I have at the bottom of the lecture as an example. But my point that I'm trying to make here with this at the front is I'm going to be talking about what scholars are doing with the digital, but it's just as important in my mind what we're asking our students to do with it. And while there are these very expensive and elaborate visualizations you're going to see here today that have taken decades of work to get them created, there are tools that allow students to do this kind of work in a semester, every single semester, and start off with much smaller steps. And so I want to make that clear that there really are sort of almost two versions of digital art history, and that having it available for your students is just as important to me as to you as a scholar. So going back to the point of the vast social networks of artists and patrons, one of the great examples of that is of mapping Gothic France through Columbia University, with sort of very much part of Stephen Murray's extraordinary work that he's done with architecture, that's been just sort of updated into a newer version of it that allows you to think about space and time. So you can see here, you can both map, there's both a map and a timeline that you can click on. These are screenshots, so I can't click into it right now, but allows you to go into any of these sites that include many, many buildings across the country of Northern Europe in general. Really, it's not just in France. You can see here through these choices at the top of the page here, all these kinds of ways you can interact with these monuments. You can look at historic plans, you can walk through the buildings. There are all kinds of ways to interact with that. So that's one example of this kind of networking tool. Another one is our very own Mapping the Medieval Woman project that was started by my colleague and I, Mariah Proctor-Tiffany, who's at California State Long Beach, in that CRESS Mapping Institute that was mentioned at the beginning, but which has continued now on to really thinking about how these women are available through their collecting, through their gift giving, through their exchange, all across not just Europe, but really the world in terms of the materials that they're using. And this is similar to the last set of papers. It hopes to be a crowdsourcing project. And at that point, then have as many scholars around the world as we can input their own data into this so that we can really see how prevalent women were in society throughout the medieval period. We are actually collaborating this summer with some other scholars who have, and I'm going to come back to these images in a second, but just to go forward here, who've already taken the first step with this. And I just wanted to give credit to Tanya Jones and Doris Sung, who have done an amazing job of creating a database that is looking more in early modern periods and looking at women as makers. But we're trying to fuse our two projects together to come up with a digital tool that allows us to visualize these kinds of things, allows us to visualize the networks of relationships between people, how those objects that are part of that networking are essential to understanding how culture worked in the medieval and early modern period, and using tools that in this case, what we're trying to do is actually build a tool that will really work for us as digital art historians. So again, we started this with Esri, with their ArcGIS, which is an amazing tool, and I'd love to return to it. But you can see I've also continued to work in Neatline, in Carto, in Palladio. I've worked with a whole series of different mapping projects, and none of them are perfect. None of them work perfectly for art historians and what we're trying to do. So we're actually trying to create that ourselves, create our own tool that will then be available for others to reproduce, depending on what your focus of your project is, if it's not about medieval women. And this is allowing us to really push on the concept of what art history can do, and how we can collect knowledge and visualize what it is that we're working on. So whether it be the spatiotemporal visualization of mapping Gothic France with its enormous number of resources, or our nascent Mapping the Medieval Women project, which allows us to compress reams of data taken from years of archival sources into a single view that can then be distilled into various map layers and interactive components. All of these are things that are essential for us to think about as digital art historians, but as digital humanists in general. And again, it's the collaboration that really makes it work so importantly. We can also look at the spatial relationship of architecture to the urban environment, and Mapping Gothic France does that, of course, already, but so does the really extraordinary project, the brainchild of Carolyn Brazilius at Duke University, but also in collaboration with the University of Venice, where they have, through reconstructions, through 3D reconstructions, and through a number of different kinds of mapping and digitization tools, they're bringing the story of Venice, the history, the long history of it, to life in a variety of capacities. So I would really encourage you to look around that site as well, as another one that really, again, pushes on the concept of how art history has operated in the past, and pulling together a whole series of different possibilities. We can reconstruct and walk through destroyed buildings, as you can see here in the digital reconstruction by Andrew Tallon. In his opinion, this close observation by laser, which invites the building to speak, and I'm using his words here, its structural state directly. It's the most promising approach to understanding the Gothic structure. And I'm showing you here a page that comes from obviously a National Geographic article that's looking at Tallon's work in the early stages of it. Not early stages of it, but before the next part of my story here. And again, I've put in links here for you to actually get through to those articles. But they become so important at this point because what he was able to do is through digital lasers, and here you can see him actually working in Notre Dame. And sadly, he is with us no more. It is an incredibly tragic thing that he's gone, but what he left us was one of the most important legacies an art historian has ever left before, which is a full digital scan of Notre Dame. And it's, I'm showing you the different versions of how it can be visualized here with the point cloud or photo wrapping or the rendered model. But it's to, millimeters. It is the exact state of Notre Dame before the fire. And so it's being used to help reconstruct it. It's something that is absolutely essential to understanding how the building operated, but also how conservationists can go forward with working on this. And there are a number of scholars who are all utilizing his work and doing much important work of their own, of course, as well, that's going into that. We can also fabricate whole three-dimensional vessels from pottery fragments, or replicate, whole objects to aid in repatriation. And here I'm showing you the Smithsonian's digitization program office. And what they did is, with the permission of the Tlingit people, and here I'm going forward to show you some details of the objects themselves, they were able to replicate this killer whale hat so that a copy could remain in the Smithsonian's collection while the actual object went back to fulfill its original function with the people. And you can see here from the video, again, that I've linked in here, of that replication process. What it's done, of course, is allow now for, again, this object to be doing its work, to be doing its job. And simultaneously a really exact copy of it. It's not the original, and that's a whole nother conversation, but a very, very, very precise copy of it is on display in the Smithsonian still. And so these technologies are things that are allowing for all kinds of both repatriation, but also in reconstruction. So for example, here again, an image, a series of images in Sketchfab, which is the sort of YouTube of 3D models. You can see I've typed in Palmyra, and what you have in there are reconstructions of many of the monuments and objects that were destroyed by ISIS. They've been reconstructed. And we now have, and those again are also going into work of remaking many of these destroyed sites after the fact, after they've been taken apart, dismembered. You can also see how the light shines through a building at different times of day and throughout the year. And here an example, really wonderful example by Kaylin Jewell of Old St. Peter's Basilica, with using this plugin that you can use within SketchUp called Shader Light, that allows you, again, to have the light shift during the course of the day, and again, during the course of the year as well. And I just want to point out, because I'm pretty sure I'm not going to make it to the slide that has this on at the end, this fall 2017 edition of Peregrinations has so many resources in it in terms of working, again, especially with students, but also with your own scholarship on the digital. And so I encourage you to, and it's linked farther down in the lecture, I encourage you to go through that in detail, because it really is such an important part of the history of digital art history when that was published. You can see from these other presentations that we have here today that there's all kinds of infrared reflectography, fused imaging, x-rays, all kinds of things, and these are coming up still, that will help us really understand how these objects and manuscripts in particular here today have worked. But it also has allowed us to think about things that look lost, right? So in this case, we're looking at a series of statues in Duke's Nasher Museum, and what was put together by the Wired Lab and other departments across campus, it's again a huge collaborative effort, is they were able to have colored light project onto these no longer polychromic statues. And each of those colors, you would then learn about the pigments, where their sources were, how they would be produced and applied to objects. And it allows for us to, again, really reckon with this concept of visitor engagement, because as I went to go visit this, I saw a young girl spend 10 minutes or more even at this at this installation, and really got involved in it in a way that she wouldn't have if she had just walked by these statues. It wouldn't have been the same experience for her. But it also puts color back on these statues, and that's something that we've discovered is a huge part of our role right now in art history, and using digital effects to make that so that there isn't this perception of our European and Mediterranean history being a white one, that in fact there was color and there was all kinds of diversity in terms of cultural diversity, but also in the way that our objects were created. And that's something that is a number of scholars have worked on seriously in trying to reverse that. And technologies like this can really make that happen. And you can see here an image of sort of full color being projected onto these figures, who really come to life at that point once you've given them their polychromy back. We can create apps that help museum visitors engage with exhibitions in new ways, like we just saw, and video games that present more historically accurate environments than ever before. And here I'm calling up Assassin's Creed, that I've not actually ever played myself, but that is also being used to help reconstruct Notre Dame, because there were so many people involved in creating the building within that video game using this game technology, that it really is an extraordinarily accurate model to follow by. And practically every week, more museums and libraries are digitizing and making available raw data of their holdings, allowing students and researchers, both professional and amateur, to deploy this data for significant and original research. And here another example of that 3D interaction that has been created by the University of York, again, hugely collaborative project, in remaking the Trinity Chapel, and all part of the shrine to Becket. That's, again, really intensely engaging because of game design that's being used here as the point of it. So here, artworks, data being released all the time, so that people are having access to this material as they never ever have before. In this digital world, then, we are sharing ideas and information like we never have before, so as to make those materials as accessible as possible. And from these examples, you can see we are grappling with how we make history, who is included in making it, and how we can use the digital as an instrument to expand upon and even disrupt our canons. Like I said, I have more here thinking about student work in particular. So here, one of my students working with data and objects from the BMFA in terms of African collection and repatriation was definitely on her mind, or another student who's done 3D scanning at a historic house here in Richmond, so that people who can't actually walk up to the second floor could actually still interact with the objects that are up there. And they're printing them out as well as just putting them into Sketchfab. Again, the example of the Virgin and Child here. And since it's at 18 minutes now, I'm going to stop with this and leave it on this slide of peregrinations. But as I've said, there's more further down in terms of online exhibits, in terms of mapping that you can do with students, a number of resources, and I'd gladly engage in that discussion at the end when we have time to talk. But for now, I will stop sharing.
All right, thank you so much, Tracy. That was fascinating and so interesting to see all of these different possibilities for reconstruction, but also for highlighting the importance of collaboration in all of these projects as well. There were a few requests, if you wouldn't mind dropping that slideshow or the PDF of it in the chat. Again, I think a few people missed it. Sure. And then for those of you who are asking, it will also be uploaded to the web as well in the Digital Medievalist webinar repository. So while that is happening, and then again, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll do that after our next speaker. Speaking of whom, Benjamin Albritton is the rare books curator and bibliographer for classics at Stanford University Libraries. In his work, he focuses on enhancing, enlarging, and celebrating the rare books and early manuscripts collections at Stanford. He works with curatorial colleagues across many different departments in the library to provide support to Stanford faculty and academic programs using special collections materials, and to raise awareness of the university's collections amongst research communities around the world. Previously a computing info systems analyst, Dr. Albritton continues to promote digital access for faculty in his current post and new ways of teaching and learning using digital tools. Dr. Albritton oversees a number of digital manuscript projects, including Parker Library on the web, recent collaborations with the Vatican Library, and a number of projects devoted to interoperability and improving access to manuscript images for pedagogical and research purposes. He has published on the music and poetry of Guillaume de Machaut and is co-editor of Medieval Manuscripts in the Digital Age, published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Albritton's talk today is entitled Image Delivery Using IIIF. Dr. Albritton.
Thanks so much, Nathan. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. First of all, thank you to Digital Medievalist team and the Medieval Academy of America team, and to my co-panelists today. When the idea of presenting on the present was sent my way, it's always a bit of a challenge because I feel like I'm mostly working in the past at this point when it comes to technology. So I'm going to be talking to you about image delivery using IIIF, specifically for medievalists. And to do that effectively, I think, let's just talk a little bit about what IIIF is. The International Image Interoperability Framework is now an organization as well as a set of protocols and a community of software developers and library technologists and scholars and researchers around the world. You can visit their site at iiif.io to get more information, to become part of the community, and to read more about what I'm going to talk about today. IIIF, though, got its start, and this is why I say I think I'm living in the past at this point. IIIF got its start in a series of workshops that began in 2009. Sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and devoted specifically to understanding interoperability between medieval digitized manuscript projects. And the three projects that were coming together around this, all supported by the Mellon Foundation, were Parker Library on the web, which launched in 2009, eCodices, the Swiss Digital National Library of Manuscripts, and the Roman de la Rose Digital Library at Johns Hopkins. As we were launching these projects in the 2000s, one of the primary concerns that we heard from researchers was a desire to compare manuscripts across these projects. Each of these projects had been built as a silo with bespoke metadata, bespoke viewers, bespoke environments. And the real desire from medieval scholars was to be able to look across these projects to compare objects. So, 12, 13 years later, we've got IIIF implemented in a number of institutions around the world. And the simplest way to describe what IIIF does is that it makes digital objects portable. So you can see I'm dragging that IIIF logo out of the environment it was in into a new viewer where I could compare it with material from any other IIIF enabled repository with the same sort of zoom functionality that's available in the home site. And as Deborah pointed out earlier, a set of metadata that travels with that object to make it coherent in a new environment. So that portability opens up a lot of possibilities for us. So just to recap, what IIIF does, it's just a mechanism for sharing images and just enough metadata for the digital object to be portable. That is, to be reusable in a number of software platforms. But all of the information, the images, that metadata, is still hosted on the Cultural Heritage Institution's platform. So you're taking the object out of that platform, reusing it elsewhere. However, IIIF doesn't do a lot of things, and I just wanted to clarify those before we talk further at this point. It does not determine how an object is described. Metadata and descriptive practices at different types of institutions in different countries, or even within a country, vary widely from institution to institution. IIIF doesn't want to get in the way of that. It doesn't make it easy for you to upload your own images into this IIIF universe for reuse by other scholars. You can do it in some ways to work with them yourself, but not for that broader sharing that the institutional backing provides. It does not provide a permanent identifier or citation link for the digital object, a problem I'll return to in a little bit, nor does it set a benchmark for image quality or size. So really, it is just a mechanism for sharing image data between software platforms. When we talk about the numbers and getting us to the present now, let's look at 2012, 2013, when IIIF implementation really started taking off. And at that point, we had a number of libraries that were supporting IIIF, and we had eCodices leading the field with about 1,500 digitized manuscripts available. That scale at the time was quite large, and the ability to look across 1,500 manuscript images and then compare them to other institutions' images at the same time was groundbreaking for a number of scholars, and it opened up a number of lines of inquiry. If we jump ahead 6 or 7 years, the large institutions began implementing, and we see that the Vatican and the BNF are now an order of magnitude higher than what we had only 5 or 6 years earlier. And they have continued to digitize at a prodigious pace. So the number of manuscripts coming online and becoming available in IIIF has jumped incredibly, to the point where we have so many images that it's possible that a single scholar wouldn't be able to work their way through them all. And that brings us up to today, where with the ongoing Vatican digitization, the upcoming launch of the German manuscript portal, the Netherlands manuscript portal that's launching, and a number of other institutions that are bringing their manuscripts available, we're looking at yet another exponential leap in available IIIF manuscript data. So this is potential for a paradigm shift in how we work with digital manuscript images. The main thing, though, that I'd like to think about is how we work with those. And so what IIIF does, through the portability that I mentioned earlier, is allow scholarly reuse and enhancement in many different environments. Just a handful are here. I point to eScriptorium and Transcribus for machine learning assisted handwritten text recognition, From the Page and other transcription platforms for crowdsourcing transcription of text, Mirador and other IIIF viewers for comparison viewing and sharing, and then Fragmentarium and other platforms for reconstructing broken books and fragments of manuscripts that exist. So this is all done by institutions pushing their images out by IIIF, and these software platforms able to consume those and allow users to do something else with them. So that means that we could, at a very simple use case, compare two manuscripts held in geographically dispersed locations. So on the left, a fragment of a manuscript in Stanford libraries. On the right, a witness of the same text in the Vatican libraries. And we can bring them up as if we're in the same location and compare them side by side at high resolution. Very simple use case, one of the foundational use cases for IIIF, and something that's still done very commonly in digital manuscript studies. The next step in that process, of course, is being able to share your close comparison. And we have software, including Project Mies here at Stanford. I'll include a link to this at the end, that allows you to save a comparison and then share it with a class, with colleagues, with fellow researchers, or just for fun out into the world. And that allows you to save a zoom level, the types of manuscripts that you're comparing or the images that you're comparing, and then make that either public or private within a work group. Again, IIIF allows us to push out images to other software for transcription without rehosting. One of the barriers to entry and was in earlier projects was the necessity to host images again and again and again at cost to the projects that were hosting those images. With IIIF, that just goes away. You drop the IIIF link into a software platform and suddenly you have new abilities to work with the manuscript that you did not have previously in the institutional portal. This includes the machine learning platforms I mentioned earlier, where models are being trained to recognize many of the medieval hands that we try to teach, and that also are a barrier to entry for people working with medieval manuscript material. So this ability to use machine learning to generate transcriptions that then will need to be checked and verified by humans, of course, is moving rapidly. So in terms of present, it feels like the future got to us a little early. And then in terms of fragmentology, IIIF and that interoperable sharing of images has very much enabled the study of fragmentology. And Dr. Lisa Fagan-Davis, of course, will tell us more about that at some point, I'm sure. But Fragmentarium allows us to use IIIF to bring together images hosted at multiple institutions, to reconstruct manuscripts, to describe them, and that sort of activity. And finally, we can start looking forward to artificial intelligence and machine learning and asking other kinds of questions of this very large corpus of material, digitized images now. And I'm showing just one example here of feature recognition using AI, where we trained an algorithm with colleagues in Montreal to recognize decorated initials across about 100,000 images from the Parker Library. And the interesting thing that comes from something like this is the reusability of an algorithm like that to begin to catalog or to gather together decorated initials across the sweep of global digitized manuscripts from many different cultures to see if there are similarities, to group them, to explore differences and similarities. Now, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was that IIIF does this, a lot of this, by allowing institutions to push their content out using these protocols and software to consume that on the other end. So as you can see in this image, arrows are pointing towards IIIF, that is that protocol layer that allows the consistent sharing across institutions, and then back out to the software platforms that users could interact with. This was the hoped for outcome of this was increased access to manuscripts worldwide at institutions that had money, at institutions that didn't have money, in countries where medieval manuscripts were not collected, European medieval manuscripts were not collected as much. It would in some ways democratize access to the digital aspects of this. However, that pushing out is just a one-way street. And one of the real challenges that we're facing is the virtuous circle or the round trip. So how do we then, as cultural heritage institutions, start bringing back in the rich scholarly information, the rich user information, the rich interactions that happen in other software environments to our digital curation and objects? So that's a challenge that we're facing right now. And it forces us to ask a number of questions. So when we look at a crowdsourcing project like the Image du Monde that Laura Moriale was so instrumental in kicking off, we have 82 collaborators transcribing IIIF-enabled manuscripts across countries, across time zones, across institutional affiliations, across levels of interest. And we want to give credit to all of them if and when those transcriptions become public. So it raises questions for the future, which we have not solved in the present, about publishing paradigms, about providing adequate credit for the information that's being created, such that it will persist with that data in the years to come, in the decades to come, in the centuries to come. Particularly if we compare our current digital environment with the print publication environment, we are still on a decades model instead of a century model like with print publication. It asks us, what is trust? Who gets to say what information is important to keep with the digital objects going forward, and who gets to verify that, who gets to assign levels of credit or quality to those materials. And finally, how do we bring all of that information back together so that we can display this dispersed data about medieval objects while giving credit to the people who have contributed to it, while allowing users to understand that the data is coming from diverse locations, institutional and non-institutional alike. So very open questions there. And pointing back to our earlier panel today, one of the big challenges around all of this, of course, is identifiers. How can we consistently describe the contents of these manuscripts themselves, and the repositories that hold them, so that we can build knowledge graphs that make sense, that do not have the same author in a non-authorial identifier, causing difficulty for searching, for cataloging, and that sort of thing. So identifiers for people, places, things, individual manuscripts, possibly pages of manuscripts or portions of a page. And more importantly, how do we build persistence into our way of thinking about these digital projects? Because we know that software on the web changes rapidly. In 3 to 5 years, many of the websites that we're looking at and the way that we're delivering our digital manuscripts now will have changed. So how do we ensure that through authority files and identifiers, through persistent URLs and URIs, and through forward-thinking architectures for software that separate out the data from the delivery method, how do we ensure that we have these things around as we invest so much time in building them? I would also like to raise another challenge here, one that was brought up by the organizers of this event, which is the question of inclusivity and equity with the projects that we're building at the present. And IIIF purports to be an international image interoperability framework. But if we look at a map of participating institutions, we can see clusters in Europe and North America, and much of the global South and other areas are not covered terribly well. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is the barrier to entry for institutions because of the technical costs of serving manuscripts by IIIF. That is a challenge. For users, finding networks of communities for outreach into areas that are not aware of the fact that streaming of manuscripts into places that don't own them, at least medieval European manuscripts, is possible at very low cost. And also, how do we come to grips with unequal access to Wi-Fi, to internet speeds? So streaming an image over the internet costs, and it costs in ways that we in North America and Europe often forget about. So bandwidth becomes a real problem when we're dealing with high resolution images and interactions with those. And this is a problem that we're going to have to address in the future, particularly if we want this to be truly a global DH community, as the organizers of this event indicated. The other challenge, of course, is the numbers. So if we look at that rise in IIIF available manuscripts to now, it looks great. It looks like we're probably quickly getting overwhelmed with the number of manuscripts available to us. But we are still only dealing with a very small percentage of available medieval European material, much less global textual material, manuscript material. So we're dealing with a very small subset. And one of the challenges is ongoing digitization in the decades ahead to think about how we get more masses of information available so that scholarship can continue to drive forward in ways that are not simply focused on the small canon of continually reproduced Western manuscripts. And the final challenge that I'll present for the present is how much IIIF do we as scholars need to know? One of the challenges for uptake for IIIF is the assumption that you actually have to understand how IIIF works at a nuts and bolts level to take advantage of it. And that's a real failing for our communities. In many ways, a scholar should be able to take advantage of IIIF through software without ever having to engage with serving a IIIF manuscript or consuming a IIIF manuscript. There are middle layers that we interact with. However, we also, as scholars, need to be aware of the linkedness, the interoperability that we are taking advantage of, so that we can advocate for the information that we create through transcriptions, annotations, mapping projects, to be preserved, credited, and reintegrated with the digital objects that are being served by IIIF now. So I will share all of these links with you, but through this slide, but also I'll make the slides available. But I do again want to thank everybody for participating today, and particularly to think about how interoperability might in the future become part of our everyday workflow as medievalists, and what the barriers to that are in the present. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, for highlighting both the possibilities and challenges of IIIF. And it strikes me anyway that so many of the challenges that you highlight are things that have been highlighted by some of our other panelists today as well, particularly around issues of collaboration and metadata. So we do have a handful of minutes for some Q&A, and if we can't get to everything now, I'm sure there'll be a little more time during our roundtable at the end of the day. So I will just start right off with one question that is anyone looking at Wikidata as a way to resolve perhaps part of the problem of persistent identifiers? And I know this goes back to the VIAF discussion from Deborah earlier as well.
I'll jump in on that. There is an engagement with the Wikidata and Wikimedia community around IIIF, particularly around image identifiers. But at the moment, institutions are also responsible for producing their identifiers. There is an effort underway in European circles and with the Digital Scriptorium group for producing identifiers for digital manuscripts that shows a lot of promise, and that could eventually merge in with Wikidata for dissemination of those identifiers. Tracy?
That's your wheelhouse, far more than mine. Thank you, though.
All right. Well, a question for Tracy then. The restored polychromes suggest another use of projected visualization involving incremental additions to Gothic structures. Is anyone working on ways of highlighting original structural elements through projection of targeted lighting or other means, so as to differentiate them from later additions, including, for example, 19th century Neo-Gothic enhancements, but also more authentic additions made in later medieval centuries? This would permit those physically visiting a site to focus on the ways in which Gothic structures grew over time, and perhaps to assist those making virtual visits to have a similar sense of the incremental nature of most Gothic structures.
No, that's an excellent question, and very much how many people are working to try and create exactly those kinds of effects, those kinds of layers, both out on a structure, as you've suggested there, with the many additions that can be made over the centuries, but also within museum settings. And I know I showed you a museum setting already with the polychromy, but all kinds of other ways you could augment objects to be able to recreate sort of original settings. And that's exactly the point that you're making with the architecture itself, that you could, through your phone, right, through being able to, scan part of a building with your phone, be able to actually visualize those kinds of things. So yes, that is definitely something a number of scholars are working on. I will say that would definitely be part of the future, though, of these three panels. There's a lot to be done in that category. Let's put it that way. It's still something that is just beginning to kind of be touched on, and it's again. Some of it is using that game design software to its full effect. The green screens that you can recreate at this point to enable all kinds of virtual settings, and also the technologies that allow it to be mobile, right? So that you could be walking around and have access to that material through the not necessarily even through Wi-Fi, through the carrier system. So there are a number of challenges to reach that, but that is definitely the vision at this point. What you've enunciated there is exactly what we're looking to try and do. And it's not necessarily my personal expertise. Like I'm far more of a digital mapper myself, but I teach this a lot. And so, and actually I'm working on a project like that with students, but on a contemporary project. It's not a medieval project, where they've brought together this sort of extraordinary layered chronological resource of a site in Richmond. So I'll get back to you as soon as I know more.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Jumping back to IIIF, at my institution, we're just starting to build our IIIF support, and one of my concerns is how we connect to expanding media types we're using, both new file types, like 3D models, for instance, and additional images with specific purposes that might be associated with an object, like multispectral images. This is bringing both of your expertise together. Can you talk a little bit about that or suggest where to find more information?
Sure. So the IIIF community does try to stay on top of emerging file types. There is a 3D community group that's discussing building out the spec for three-dimensional imaging. And then multispectral imaging is also, and scientific imaging of cultural heritage objects in general, is a deep interest. I'll share my screen just a minute to show some possibilities. But basically, IIIF allows us to layer up images and then change opacity on them. So we can see a 3D scan of a Diego Rivera mural here with basically a height map of the paint below it, so that you can get a sense of where work is taking place, how the object is being constructed. And of course, this also works very well for multispectral imaging for medieval manuscripts. And there are examples of that already in the Project Mirador site, and then also in the IIIF community. So if you're interested in this sort of information, there's a IIIF Slack team that you can join, or get on one of the IIIF community calls, and feel free to ask questions there. There's also a mailing list. So if you're trying to build institutional knowledge about how to get started with this, a lot of resources through the IIIF.io site for both community knowledge and then asking all different kinds of levels of questions about it.
Tracy, did you want to add anything from your own perspective?
No, I think what Benjamin's talked about there really answers it well enough. Thank you.
Great. So as far as I can see, for IIIF annotations, rehosting of the digital images is still necessary to secure annotations in case the institutions change IIIF images. Do you see any future solutions to this?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so we sort of blithely go about doing transcriptions on the current images that are being served up. And the annotations target specific regions on a canvas, and an image is painted onto that canvas. So there's a layer of abstraction that happens there. which gets a little complicated if an institution changes their URIs for the images, or if they actually change the dimensional size of that canvas on which the image sits. So right now, we don't have very good solutions for securing those annotations for the future. However, the more annotations that get made, there is an increased impetus to maintain that canvas space with the correct URI and correct dimensions so that annotations can continue to target it and then overlay any version of an image that's appropriate. That's the future. And we're not there yet.
All right. Then there's a question, where can we learn more about the reuse of IIIF images without having to rehost the material? I think, Ben, you already pointed to a couple examples of that. I know there's some excellent tutorials out there as well. And I think, Lisa, you've hosted some workshops on this as well. So I do think there are lots of resources like that out there without having to get too far into the tech side of things. I am running out of questions on this end. I will give a moment if anybody would like to get another question in here. We've got some really fascinating projects going on in the chat as well.
That's what I was going to say, is just to point out, make sure everybody's noticing those, because they're excellent examples that Tanya and Alexander have given us here at CUNY and on Sardis.
I'm going to share Tanya's to everybody else as well so that everybody can see that.
Nathan, can I say just one thing in response to what Jean just asked about sharing IIIF images without rehosting? Because IIIF is open source and open access, there aren't a whole lot of strict rules about how institutions make that sharing or facilitate that sharing. The best practices that are sort of developing in kind of an organic way are that institutions should make it easy for you as the user to just grab that IIIF logo and drop it into a shared canvas, or very easily copy the IIIF persistent URL and drop that into a shared canvas that you're using. And not everyone does that. Which is still, I think, and Ben can certainly comment on this, it's still kind of being worked out by different institutions. There are a lot of institutions whose images are being served through IIIF, but as a user, you wouldn't know it to look at the images or to look at the record. You have to sort of have insider info and then know how to parse what the IIIF persistent URL should be.
And that was certainly the case for the BNF the last time I checked as well.
Yeah. Sorry, but Ben, go ahead.
No, just to build on what Lisa's saying, the other part of that in terms of getting access to the IIIF pixels and things like that is the metadata that Deborah pointed to in the Universal Viewer, which is being driven by a IIIF implementation. One of the emerging best practices for institutions is to clearly license or put in the public domain the restrictions on use in that manifest, so that no matter where the digital object goes, a user has an understanding of how they can use those materials. Again, though, that's, as Lisa mentioned, that's emerging best practice. It's not consistent across institutions at the moment.
All right, well, we are still a minute ahead of time, but the only question that I have left that hasn't been answered is, how do we clap? Do we clap? And so I will lead us anyway in thanking our panelists here. We will be taking another 30-minute break, and we will resume at, I believe, 2 o'clock Eastern time anyway, for our last panel of the afternoon, to be followed by a roundtable with all of our participants as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.